Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for those who are joining for the discussion of my new book called Building a Resilient Tomorrow, How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption. My name is Leonardo Martinez-Diaz. I'm currently director of the Sustainable Finance Center at the World Resources Institute in Washington. And I wrote this book with a colleague of mine. Her name is Alice C. Hill. We started this book when we were both working in government during the Obama administration. Alice was working as President Obama's resilience officer at the White House, and I was across the street at the US Treasury heading the Energy and Environment Office. And as we were working in government during that very exciting period, we came to realize that one of the areas that was not getting enough attention was climate resilience. Most of the attention was being placed rightly on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Agreement, how do we get our emissions down in the United States and abroad? But at the same time, it was very clear that we had to start preparing for some of the impacts of climate change. And that even though we are cutting emissions, we are not doing so quickly enough. And even if we were able to cut those very quickly, there is still some climate change that's already been baked into the system because of the emissions that are already in the atmosphere and because of the heating that has already taken place. And as the planet's systems begin to adapt, there are still more impacts yet to come. And so we wanted to put a spotlight on those impacts and to the fact that we need to start preparing for some of those impacts now. The main, I think, message of the book is that any preparations that we take now, if we are able to put in place the systems and the data and the education that we need now, we will be able to reduce some of those impacts and to recover more effectively from those impacts that do occur. And so we wanted, above all, a narrative that is not a narrative of a catastrophe. We are concerned that at this point, a lot of the conversation on climate change is beginning to center around a discourse of the apocalyptic, of this inevitable catastrophe that's coming. And the reality is that there are things we can do, certainly on cutting emissions, and we need to keep doing that, but also on the adaptation side, on the resilience side. And that is the piece we wanted to highlight. And so the book is not a long discourse on all the bad things that could happen, but rather shining a light on those people today who are working to put in place more resilient communities, more resilient companies, and more resilient countries. And we're hoping that folks will learn from those experiences and will find that there are things that we can do to help prepare. And so one way to try to pull together a book that was not for specialists and for insiders was a book that was going to be expansive. It's a landscape piece, so it will cover quite a number of topics, and it's written for the average educated reader, right? Because we're cutting across many disciplines. So we wanted to make sure it was an accessible book that can be read by folks from any discipline who are curious about what's happening in law, in engineering, in finance, even though they may not be working in those spaces. And at the same time, and this is not a secret at all, we want to get young people to read those books, to read the book, especially those that are currently thinking about their career choices and what are they going to do with their lives. We want engineers to think about engineering and climate change. We want healthcare professionals to think about health and climate. And so we certainly want many of those in the scientific community to help us think more about how to prepare for those impacts. The way we tried to structure the book was through a series of 10 lessons. And take the word lessons very casually. But we thought it might be a way to present what is going on in the space and to help showcase the fact that there are things that we are learning, that we have indeed drawn some lessons from the experience so far. The first lesson is about rethinking where and how we build. The book is very much focused on the United States, but it draws heavily on international experience. And the first lesson, it seemed to us, had to be about the built environment, about the infrastructure that we are designing and putting in place now. And as you may know, in this country, we don't have a single unified national building code. Those are very much set at the state level, and they are influenced by dynamics at the local level. So as a result, we have a patchwork of building codes all across the country. some of which are very robust, and others which are basically non-existent or extremely lax. To give you an example, the city of Houston in Texas had one of the most lax building codes in the country until Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, pouring about 50 inches of rain on the city in a very short amount of time, causing enormous damage. And then very quickly as a result, the city decided to tighten its building code, and now we'll have to see if it is actually enforced and changes the way in which we build in Texas. A main point of this lesson is that we have to build for the future, not just the past. The trends, the statistics that we know about historically and have been used to design everything from nuclear power plants to residential buildings no longer will hold in the future because of the way in which climate is changing the patterns of precipitation, sea level rise, wildfires. And so we have to think about designing and siting infrastructure in places that have been now planned to be safe in the future, not just in the past. And that is going to take a while to really get internalized into our laws, into our regulations, into our engineering schools, into our architecture design schools, because it will require a change in the way we do business. But it is crucial in order to make sure that we have communities that are safe. A second lesson is lawyer up. By that we mean there is going to be, and there already are, lots of judicial actions, lawsuits in the system. You'll certainly know about the famous ones with sort of the children suing the federal government for failing to protect our climate through Juliana, as the case, the name of the case. That is not the kind of case we're covering here. We did mention them, but the cases in this chapter are about who pays. Who will pay for the damage to specific facilities, to homes, to commercial buildings? You will have insurance companies suing some of the policyholders for not taking enough attention or enough action to protect themselves. You'll have citizens suing governments for not doing enough to, for example, ensure that the drainage system of a city is sufficient to withstand the rain from a climate-enhanced downpour. There will be all sorts of characters suing each other in the system, and we already see that. We mention a few of these kinds of lawsuits, and the system will take quite a while to sort of work through these. But ultimately, it's going to try to address this fundamental question, right? Who should be paying for this? And perhaps those lawsuits will make some of the decision makers in the system more attuned to the fact that they have a responsibility. Corporate board members, architects, planning and zoning officials, they will all be potentially exposed to lawsuits for not taking enough duty of care in a world that is warming. And as a result, we think perhaps all of these lawsuits will lead to greater incentives for building resilience. Third lesson is about markets. We often hear about carbon markets to help us reduce emissions, but here we talk about how can different kinds of markets help us build resilience. How do we make markets work for resilience? By markets, I mean, for example, real estate. The prices of real estate have traditionally not reflected the dangers of climate change. There's lots of very expensive property in Miami, for example, that is right on the side of the water, and which are increasingly at considerable risk of flooding. And yet the prices do not yet seem to reflect that. We look around many different parts of New York City, for example, and even after Sandy, there's still lots of additional construction going up. And again, the prices are only now just beginning to show some of this climate risk. We overall look at several markets. We look at stock markets, bond markets, insurance markets, and real estate markets, and ask, to what extent are we pricing in the risk? If we were able to price in the risk, then we will be sending a signal to buyers and sellers of all of these different things that they ought to pay attention to climate risk. And so far, this risk remains hidden. It's largely dormant inside these pricing and buying and selling decisions. And so the hope here is that we can eventually bring out the signal and that will incentivize players to consider, to avoid things that are risky and to put their money where there is resilience and where there is less risk. This will take a while, and we talk in the chapter about what is happening in that space. We need to find better ways to pay for resilience. This might seem obvious, but it isn't. Many people think the government will take care of it, that there will be sort of a lot of public resources devoted to resilience, and of course the government will play a big role, not just the federal government, but also state and local governments. But we have to think of smarter ways to do it, because there's just not enough money to pay for all the things that are required. And at the end of the day, you can only raise taxes so much, right? So we draw an inventory of things, ideas, both traditional and more innovative, that can help us raise money for building resilience. For example, we talk about how green bonds can be put to work in this area. Green bonds have typically been used to finance efforts to reduce carbon emissions, to increase energy efficiency, to build renewable energy facilities. But we're saying here, perhaps green bonds could also help to raise money for resilience and adaptation. What about using some of the money from carbon taxes, which are increasingly popular, and earmarking some of that money for resilience? As you know, here in Washington State, there's been 2 efforts, so far unsuccessful, to put in place a carbon tax. And a big part of that controversy was, how are we going to use the proceeds of the carbon tax? Well, we think that ultimately we're going to have to accept the fact that some of that money should be earmarked for resilience, because ultimately that will help us reduce the losses, and it's actually extremely cost effective. For every $1 of resilience investments, we can save up to $6 of damages to society. Very important here at AAAS, get the data, but make it usable. In this chapter, we talk about a lot of the stuff that's going on next door here, the NASA satellites, the incredible amounts of data that we are collecting. We're collecting now more data about the weather and the climate than we ever have in the history of humanity. And yet, a lot of that data is not yet usable. It's not yet made sufficiently downscaled for decision makers at the local level. And it is not yet in interfaces and platforms that allow small town planning commissions and small, medium-sized businesses and architects designing new facilities to actually make decisions with it. I think yesterday some of you may have seen a very interesting panel on coastal protection planning here in Washington State. And it was a very good example of how folks are taking very sophisticated climate modeling and lots of data about our built environment and our coasts, and bringing it down, boiling it down, and translating it for people who have to make very specific decisions. Do I build this thing here? Do I move this road over here? How do we best deploy our limited dollars for resilience? And so that ability to not just collect that incredible data and use more drones and satellites and land-based sensors, but to then translate the data and make it usable is going to be absolutely critical. And very importantly, that data has to be available at either free or very low and accessible pricing. We, in this chapter, talk about how there could be a real war over who pays for that data and who has access to the data. And there will be lots of pressure to ensure that this data goes only to the highest bidder. But we will need absolutely a public good here, which is data for many people to use. Work with human nature. What we mean by this is people have all these biases, cognitive biases. We tend to systematically underestimate the probability of things that we can't imagine very clearly, or that we don't have in our living memory, right? We tend to systematically value more a loss of $1, for example, hurts us more than the earning of $1 tomorrow. There's all kinds of other so-called cognitive biases that affect our ability to make good decisions. And as a result, some have argued that we can deploy various nudges, various ways of framing a problem in a way that helps people make better decisions. This has been applied to ways to ensure that people pay their taxes. You will have heard, for example, the idea of using the default option for organ donors on your driver's license. If you make being an organ donor the default option, far many more people will choose that than if you do the inverse and make people opt in, right? These kinds of framing techniques can help us do better on climate adaptation. We provide a few examples of how that can happen. Then we turn to some of the harder questions, the last few chapters are about the really important, frankly, quite difficult challenges. The first is about the healthcare system. As you will know, as the planet warms, some of these these vectors of disease will continue to advance, especially diseases carried by mosquitoes, for example. We're talking here about Zika, malaria, chikungunya, and others are beginning to gradually shift their geographical expanse and move north. And so we start the chapter talking about Zika, that terrible disease that affects especially newborns and pregnant women and can lead to brain damage in the newborn. This is a disease that before was only seen in very tropical areas in the southern hemisphere of the world, and suddenly you started to see it show up in the Caribbean, in Florida, and even farther north. In this chapter, we talk about how we need to harden the healthcare system. We need hospitals, for example, in Houston, that are putting in place measures to continue to provide service even during hurricanes and during major storms. We're talking about hospitals in California that can continue to function with wildfire smoke surrounding the buildings. They have to be able to continue to operate in those circumstances. And we need a healthcare system that is smarter, that is able to predict and project where some of these new diseases might come, and how do we then equip our healthcare professionals and our health policy experts to help to move around this challenge. We talk about the importance of medical schools to begin teaching about climate change and incorporating climate impacts into the curriculum. Inequality is one of the toughest of all the challenges we look at. As some of you may have read, as climate change continues to impact communities around the country and the world, it will often first hit the poor and most vulnerable communities, regardless of what country you're talking about. In the book, we talk about Norfolk, Virginia, a city that's perhaps best known for its enormous military installations, the largest naval base in the world, 29 military facilities. But it also happens to have a very socially fragmented profile. There's of the 250,000 residents of Norfolk, a fifth of them live under the poverty line. That's twice the rate in Virginia. There's a long history of racism and prejudice that has contributed to that. And those folks happen to be located, in many cases, in areas that are highly flood prone. And so you can see how climate change is making a situation that for historical and economic reasons is already very unequal, even more unequal. And you can tell that story a million times around communities in the United States and certainly around the world. And so the question here is, how do you protect those poor and vulnerable communities first? How do you ensure that you have in place programs and interventions that will help make sure that we look after those folks first, because they will be affected first? We talk, for example, about the heat wave in Chicago in 1995, which has been studied extensively, and concluded that those that did the worst, the places where the mortality rates during the heat wave were the highest, were communities that were isolated, where folks were scared to go out and check up on their neighbors, where there were very weak social ties between the different residents. And as a result, it was a place where dying alone was much more common. And these are the kinds of patterns then that we can now try to find and try to address. There are companies now that are using artificial intelligence, for example, to cross-check multiple databases and then alert first responders. And you should check on these houses, these addresses first, because there's likely people here who have disability, who may be living alone, who may be elderly or sick and need to be looked after first. These kinds of heat programs have been put in place now across Europe, in India, in Canada, and increasingly in the United States. These are examples of ways in which we have to learn from the past to ensure that we can at least put a buffer on inequality. At the same time, there are those who want to be even more ambitious and see how we can use the rethinking of our institutions as climate advances to address some of these historical injustices, and you'll see that in the Green New Deal and so on. But here we talk about even more basic than that. We need to figure out how to protect the poor and vulnerable first. The second to last lesson is a very tough one, which is relocating people to safer ground. There are places that will be very difficult to save, where it may not make sense to invest enormous amounts of money to ensure that people can continue to live there before flooding or other disasters make this impossible. You already will have heard about places like Miami and other cities that are really very difficult to protect because of the nature of the topography there and sea level rise. And so the question then has to become increasingly, what do we do with these communities? In this chapter, we look at what the US government has been doing so far. We've relied very heavily on voluntary buyouts, basically programs where the government will come in and buy your home at market rates and allow you to move somewhere else. And this has worked up to a point. The problem is twofold. One is there's just not enough money yet for these kinds of programs. And secondly, some folks don't want to leave. They want to stay because cultural ties are very strong to their communities. Because, for example, folks may not want to move because they already have a home that is well suited to their needs and they want to start from scratch. And as a result, you get these patterns of communities where you have folks who took the buyouts and folks who didn't take the buyouts. So the community is still at danger. The government still has to provide public services to their community. And the community now has a patchwork of empty lots and vacant homes. This is not a smart way to do this. We need to figure out how to be able to ultimately move folks voluntarily and gradually and constructively as a group. We look at a couple of experiments where this has been tried. Louisiana, Alaska are two places. But the cost is astronomical, something like $600,000 per person in the case of a village in Alaska. We obviously can't do that, so we're going to have to find more efficient and effective ways to start that conversation. And ultimately, our local leaders, our politicians, which so far have avoided the issue of so-called managed retreat, to embrace it and perhaps help us find a way to talk about it in a way that highlights the economic opportunities that actually could come from this, rather than just look at it as defeat or as some sort of giving up on a community. We think the earlier we start talking about this problem, the better, and we call for the creation of a national strategy for relocation that can help make the movements of people to safer ground less traumatic, more gradual, and hopefully one that leads to a better life and a better livelihood, rather than the type of forced immigration, frankly, that we saw during Katrina, for example. And finally, those who are interested in international politics will like the last chapter, which is about national security. In some cases, it's about the nuts and bolts of national security. How do you make sure that American military forces are ready to be deployed and can function effectively when some of our military facilities are now under threat from climate change? We talk about, for example, a base in the South Pacific that we use to launch different types of missiles and radar systems, which is now at threat of permanent flooding because climate change was not considered when the design plans were put in place. We talk about different bases that have been affected by hurricanes, destroying or putting at risk warplanes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We talk about places, again, like Norfolk, where military personnel may not be able to get to work because of flooded streets. So the ability of the United States to actually be prepared for a military conflict, or even to be able to project power in the world, is already under threat from climate change. And this is something that keeps planners at the Pentagon up at night. And they're trying to move forward even as the government, the rest of the government, tells them not to use the C word, climate. But it is something that the military sees as a fundamental threat to American security. Beyond that, we look at the danger of so-called fragile states becoming more fragile. And this is the problem of climate change destabilizing places, the Horn of Africa, the South Indian continent, the South Asian continent, becoming more unstable as a result of, for example, more increased droughts and other events that would displace people across borders and exacerbate already existing security problems. We talk about Syria and people being displaced from Syria. We talk about the Pakistan-India border as a particularly important one. So this chapter really is about, we've got to think about our national security in new terms, in a new light, as climate change begins to threaten places that before we considered to be invulnerable, and as competition for resources begins to heat up. This is, again, one of those really hard questions, which is why we put it close to the end, but it is one that will require all of us who work in the space, national security professionals, and those interested in international development to really think very hard about how to deal with this. Those are the 10 lessons. Each one, of course, packs quite a lot, but we try to keep it conversational. We try to use, again, uplifting examples of things that are going right, because we're going to have to do so much more. And in the end, we want to plant some seeds across many different disciplines. We conclude with the idea that we need a lot more of 3 different kinds of people, some of whom may be represented here. The first is silo breakers. We need folks who can talk and organize across disciplinary boundaries. We find that in government, there's, of course, siloed agencies doing their own thing, and coordination is always difficult. In the scientific world, we find that many disciplines, whether it's medicine or climate science or engineering, oftentimes does not talk to one another about climate impacts, and now we're going to have to. So silo breakers are those folks who can help translate and who can help connect folks across those boundaries, and we're going to need a lot more of those. We talk about a few examples. The second, of course, is communicators, people who can help explain what is happening and persuade people to take the steps we need for resilience. We talk about, for example, the mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey, Dawn Zimmer, who helped convince her community, who did not want to take money from the federal government to harden the infrastructure against flooding, because they were concerned about the impact on their property values, because this infrastructure is pretty unsightly and would ruin the views. She persuaded them that this is a good thing for the future of the community, and therefore we should do it. Those types of folks who can convince communities to take the hard steps, whether it's relocation or a new infrastructure, are going to be critical. And finally, we have the translators, those folks who are able to take the difficult models, the scientific data, the climate modeling, and to translate it to folks on the ground who need to make decisions, who need to understand what it all means without having PhDs in advanced sciences, right? And those types of skills are difficult to find, but they're going to be increasingly necessary in a warming world. Let me stop here, and we have a couple of minutes left for questions. The Oxford University Press, who published our book, was not able to be here, but the book is available on the Oxford University Press website, Amazon, etc. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a great talk. What do you feel like, is there anything that you feel like you have not addressed that's still that thing that's out there, number one? And then number two, what are you focused on now moving forward? What's your main interest?
Thank you for that. There's an obvious gap I think people will notice, which is food security, agriculture, and water. We focus a lot on the built environment and on the healthcare system and national security, but the agriculture component is enormous. We didn't feel that we had the expertise to really delve into it, and we're very honest about that in the introduction. There's others who are doing very valuable work in this space, but that's certainly an area that needs lots and lots of attention. Right now we are focusing on getting this book and the ideas out to a broader public, not just within the climate community, if you will, but much beyond. We're getting some high schools to teach it in high school, which is fantastic. And we're hoping that there'll be more and more debate about how to do this. So that's our focus right now. I think it's the part of the translation work, and we expect that will take a bit longer. Thank you so much. I'm told that we're out of time, but happy to take questions on the side, and thank you very much for coming.